Okay, so today we're going to be talking about mental health and the microbiome and how those things link together. It's a little bit complex, so I'm going to be drawing you some lovely pictures, so be prepared to be wowed. So I have a clinic here on the coast. I treat people Australia-wide. My clinic specialises in this area, so I don't do general naturopathics like most naturopaths do. I just do a very niche sort of area. My specialty is in digestive bacteria and how that relates to the rest of our health. The most common health complaints we get in are depression, anxiety, OCD. We get insomnia, so that's difficulty falling asleep and staying asleep. Come on in. Then we get fatigue. So chronic fatigue syndrome is directly linked to gut bacteria, and reliance on caffeine for stimulation. So some people just feel pretty lousy if they don't get their buzz each day. We get cognitive issues, so brain fog, ADD and ADHD is a massive one. So the diagnosis at the moment of ADD is just phenomenal. I'm getting almost every client comes in with that. Massive digestive issues, so IBS, constipation, diarrhea, food intolerances, wind or bloating, or just inconsistent stool formation. Pain is a big one, so our digestive bacteria regulate most of our pain response. Immune issues, so colds, flus, autoimmunity, and disordered eating and substance use disorders. So we get a lot of addiction through the door. Okay, so how mental health treatment has evolved over the years. So back in the 16th century, it was treated as a physical disease, and it was treated through rest, religious counsel, astrology and herbal remedies, so sounds pretty good. And then in the 1800s we started to produce asylums. A lot of the asylums were actually produced for experimentation purposes, so that's fun. They use drugs, malaria injections or insulin injections. A lot of these treatments turned out to be lethal, but they kept trying for a little while before they worked out that every person that got these injections died. They didn't really care because they sort of thought it was the fringes of society. And then experimental surgeries were introduced. So we started doing lobotomies and electric shock therapy. So that was introduced in the 1800s. In the mainstream system, we're still using some of those same therapies. So we haven't changed much since then, which is pretty alarming. We're still using some psychosurgery, and electric shock therapy is still being advocated in the mainstream system, despite the fact it causes permanent brain damage. So thankfully we've stopped burning witches, but only just. So the mainstream mental health system now, we really only have two toolkits. So we have psychiatry, their only toolkit is drugs. So if you go to a psychiatrist, the outcome is always a medication. Then we have psychology, which is our primary option as well. So they focus on CBT principles, so cognitive behavioural therapy, changing your thought processing, things like that. They are all talk therapies, and they are really good strategies. So you can learn some really good ways to cope with your environment and stress, but they don't actually change the physical damage that occurs when we go through these processes. So today we're going to talk about that. So I believe we need a revolution. So the statistics of mental health in Australia are pretty alarming. We actually are the most depressed country in the world, which is pretty full on. So 45% of Australians will suffer mental illness in their lifetime. In 2020 we lost 3,139 people to suicide. So that's about 9 people a day. In the same 12-month period we lost 278 people to homicide. So it's great, nobody's walking around murdering anybody in this country, we're pretty safe. You're much more likely to die at your own hand than somebody else's. 1 in 5 Australians have reported having mental health issues in 2020, which is the same rate as 2017, which is pre-COVID. So all this talk of this COVID causing this mental health crisis is nonsense. It was there well before COVID hit us. And we were ignoring it at the same rate then as we are now. And 99 deaths by suicide occurred in children and adolescents in 2020. So it's a really alarming statistics in Australia. There is a lot of funding that's going into mental health, but they've shifted away from the centralised model into private psychologists, and it's just not getting the same volume of people through, so there's some real gaps in the system. All right, so let's talk about how mental health is a physical problem. So how all of these things link up. So we have digestive bacteria, and our digestive bacteria do so much that you wouldn't think. So they produce most of our nutrients, as far as our B vitamins and things like that occur. They stabilise, they produce most of our neurotransmitters. So our neurochemistry is the brain chemicals, I can't talk and write at the same time. So our neurochemistry is the brain chemicals that determine all of our behavioural characteristics. So our sleeping, eating, drinking behaviours, our interactivity with other people, our sense of self, our self-esteem, all of our sensory information. So whether things are bright and, whether it's too noisy and too loud, or whether our environment's comfortable for us. It regulates our memory, our cognition, so pretty much everything. All of our digestive function is regulated by neurochemistry as well. So what happens when we get a digestive bacterial imbalance is we don't get the right levels of neurochemistry, and that leads to a deficit in our ability to cope with stress. So our stress hormones increase because our neurochemistry does most of our primary problem solving. So when we start to get depletion of neurotransmitters, we get an increase in stress hormones. Stress hormones actually shut off gastric acid production, which changes the pH and further impacts digestive bacterial colonies, which means worse neurotransmitters, worse stress hormones, worse bacteria. And it becomes a bit cyclic. So once you get past a certain point, it can't really self-correct. Then stress hormones are our primary hormones, and we have sex hormones as our secondary hormones. So often at this point, we see women coming into clinic saying, okay, I'm here because I have problems with my period. And I say, well, what about everything else? You never get here without this. There's nothing, this is never impacted without the rest of these pathways being impacted. So they're usually complaining about this because they're ignoring the fatigue, and they're ignoring that they feel lousy every day, and they're ignoring that they don't have great self-esteem, and they just think that it's the society rather than something going wrong inside. Also, we don't talk about stool formation very often. We don't tell people what a good poo should look like and what it should feel like. So when it comes to, inconsistent stool formation, a lot of people don't even know they have it. So everyone says to me, no, I go to the toilet every day. I poo really great. And I'm like, well, what colour is it? Oh, it's kind of yellow. That's not great. It's kind of black. That's really not great. Or it's sloppy, or it's little pebbles. So all of those things are telling us that there's a bacterial issue and a neurochemical issue. We then have two more things that impact this. So we have nutrition. We have two types of nutrition. So one's called exogenous nutrition, that's the stuff you put in your mouth, and one's endogenous nutrition, which is the nutrition that comes from digestive bacteria. Our nutrition impacts digestive bacteria and is produced by digestive bacteria. Our nutrition impacts stress hormones, neurochemistry. So once we start to get nutritional deficiencies, which is inevitable with a digestive issue because they regulate most of our nutrition, everything starts to drop off. Then we end up with methylation issues, which is the process that our liver uses to clear stuff out. So when we get methylation issues, we start to get inflammatory conditions. So we see people with rheumatoid arthritis, or all of your autoimmune conditions coming up. We'll see allergies, food allergies, sensitivities to our environment. Or you'll see estrogen dominance, so you'll see issues with estrogens, you'll see issues with stress hormones, you'll see issues with digestive bacteria, you'll see issues with nutrition, and you'll see issues with our neurochemistry. So they all impact each other. So once you get to this point, you can't just treat one, you have to treat them all collectively. And that's why when you go at this point and you go, oh right, things are pretty bad now, I better go to the doctor. And the doctor says, take an antidepressant, something like an SSRI, and it'll work on one of our neurotransmitters out of the 7 that cause depression when they're depleted. So you can see how something like that isn't going to correct all of this other stuff going on. And you can see how changing your thought processing isn't going to correct the damage that's already shifted in this gut bacteria, or the changes in these methylation pathways. You can correct it through nutrition, but gosh, you've got to try really hard. You've got to eat an almost impeccable diet for about 12 months to correct bacteria through nutrition, and it's pretty impossible in this type of environment. And what is a perfect diet? I mean, that's dependent on your specific bacteria, so you have to know what's in there to be able to treat it through diet as well. So this is what we're treating actively at the Health Recovery Centre. All right, so when we talk about mental health, these are the things that impact it, and that's the things we've discussed here. You'll see there's an additional one down the bottom here that says environmental factors. So trauma is the single biggest cause of this condition. Relationship breakdowns, things like that. They start this cascade off by impacting this stress hormone. So all you need is a bit of stress to start this whole process. I don't know anybody that has a stress-free life that ends up in an environment where everything's cozy and perfect all the time. So let's talk about neurotransmitters specifically. So the production of neurotransmitters is literally a recipe. So if you want good neurochemistry, you have to have the right gastric acid production, the right proteins being ingested, which a lot of people aren't having the best protein ingestion in Australia because we have the availability of so much carbohydrate, which tastes delicious, right? So why would you choose a nice, healthy, piece of protein over a mountain of chocolate? I know I'd choose the chocolate some days. Then we have to have good digestive enzyme release, which is dependent on that acid as well, and then the right bacteria, specifically E. coli. Then we have these pathways. So we then have our primary protein, which breaks down through the pathways to become our neurotransmitters, which are circled in red here. So this isn't all of our neurotransmitters. This is just 3 of our pathways. But you can see it's literally a nutritional recipe. We've got our B vitamins, we've got iron, we've got calcium, we've got our minerals, we've got vitamin C. So without the right nutrition, you don't have the right neurochemistry. Your brain simply doesn't work. So somebody with issues, for example, in this pathway is going to have, dwelling thoughts. They're going to be thinking about things that happened 10 years ago, awkward things that happened to you at high school. That's lots of fun. Then we have this pathway here. If we have a low dopamine pathway, we're going to have issues with motivation. This is going to be someone that wakes up in the morning and goes, what is the point? Or they start projects but never complete them. They definitely aren't getting up, going for a run every day and thinking, geez, that felt good. It just doesn't work like that. Without that pathway, our rewards pathways don't work. If this pathway is getting significantly depleted, you're going to start looking at addictions and things like that. The serotonin pathway, hi, come on in, is part of our sleep cycles. It's our sensory perception. So people with low serotonin always have sensory issues. So they get overstimulated by sound, overstimulated by bright lights, things like that. I often get women with low serotonin coming in saying, my husband chews so loud. He's just such a loud chewer. I could just murder him. So don't murder your husband. We just need to treat that pathway and you might like your husband again, maybe. So we can see here that these pathways, our anxiety and depression are regulated by the same neurotransmitters. So generally, if you have one, you have a bit of the other. People don't very often come in and say, I've got really bad anxiety, but I'm happy as hell. It just doesn't really happen like that. Ooh. All right, so sorry, I'm just squeezing past you again. Okay, so our neurotransmitters cause so many different symptoms. So we've touched on a few of these. So all that sensory input, eating, drinking behaviours. So all of our eating disorders come from this neurochemistry deficits. Our sleep-wake cycle's regulated by this. We have depression, aggression. In men, we tend to see more frustrated outbursts. In women, we tend to, go into ourselves. That's just related around the testosterone pathway as well. Digestion obviously gets out of whack, and then attention span, memory, learning ability, thought processing. Interestingly, when you see this in kids, you just see a naughty kid. You see a naughty kid that has big temper tantrums. If you treat it then you end up with a teenager that's happy rather than a teenager with these behavioural issues that tend to lead on through life and end in adrenal fatigue and mental breakdowns in their late teens. Okay, on to digestive bacteria. So bacteria do everything. They make neurotransmitters. So even if they just did that one thing, that's a really big job. So it determines most of our health. They produce butyrate, which is our Krebs cycle. So if we don't have enough of the right digestive bacteria, we end up with chronic fatigue syndrome. So every 10% reduction in Bacteroides species is a 10% increase in fatigue. So if you have no Bacteroides, your body really doesn't work. It has to rely on a secondary fuel source, something like one of your hormonal systems, and eventually that'll crash too. They provide essential fatty acid synthesis, so they make hormones. They provide most of our B12, assist in production of vitamin D, K and other nutrients, and they're essential for mental and physical health. They assist with protein, fat and carb digestion, so no bacteria, no digestion. And they're responsible for 80% of our IgA immunity. So if you want to have a really robust immune system so that you don't come across, when you do come across colds and flus or the big C, then you're pretty strong against that. Then making sure that you have the right bacteria is the way to do that. Using hand sanitizers is not the way to do that because it kills bacteria. So the more of that you stuff on your hands, the worse your immune system becomes. They also cause or reduce inflammation. So we have essential or helpful bacteria and then some other guys. Some of your other guys are also in the helpful column, and the reason that they're the same is because it's quantitative. So what's actually relevant is the quantity of bacteria, not the specific bacteria that's there so much. You can see here that we have our lactobacillus and bifidobacteria in our essential column. This is what's in most of our probiotics. Interestingly, they should only amount to around 5% of our digestion overall, or our bacteria overall. I'm getting clients who have been on taking probiotics long term because someone told them it was good for their health, and they're in my clinic because they've taken too many probiotics. So, and it's overthrown all of their other bacterial colonies that do more essential roles than they do. So I wouldn't put probiotics in your mouth unless you've tested your gut and you know what's in there. If you'd have too much bifidobacteria, for example, you will have IBS. So taking probiotics long term can cause the symptoms that you come to me to treat. But stopping those probiotics doesn't fix the problem because it's already damaged all of those other bacterial colonies, so you've got to fix it. So yeah, be cautious with food ferments in a country where we have high fibre diets. Food ferments are really, you know, they were always introduced in countries where they had very low fibre diets over the winter. So think all your Scandinavian countries, you know, the northern end of Europe, all of your cold sections of Asia, things like that. Those food ferments are essential there. Here where we have a high fibre diet and we're putting in food ferments all the time, we're putting in all sorts of bacteria. We're not just growing the bacteria we want. I'm getting a lot of people in the clinic with soil bacteria and animal bacteria growing in their gut because it's fermented in those foods. Okay, so to do microbiome testing, I use BioScreen Medical. I wouldn't use anyone else. If you do go to another naturopath and they recommend you to get a CDSA or something like that, I always go with a BioScreen Medical test because they're the most reliable in my clinic. So using a cultured testing method, as far as actual treatment goes, I get considerably better outcome. Okay, so this is an example of a BioScreen Medical test. This is somebody's test. You can see that the bacteria count's really low and the aerobe count is low. E. coli, which is our most critical bacteria, is very low in this client at 1.7 by 10 to the power of 6. This person is going to have depression. They're going to have cognitive issues. They're going to be feeling pretty foggy, probably pretty cranky too. This staph count is not ideal. Staph is very aggressive. It will easily overthrow E. coli. So if this was left alone, you'd notice that E. coli getting lower and the staph getting higher. They also have next to no Bacteroides, so they're going to be very fatigued. They've got no lactobacillus. Their immune system's going to be lousy. And then they've got a ton of Clostridia, so they're going to be all over the place. They're definitely going to have some significant health issues. All right, hormones. So stress hormones are our third major point. So we've talked about neurochemistry, we've talked about bacteria, and then now we're going to talk about stress hormones. These are the 3 points we have to test to be able to accurately treat this once it's got this far. So hormones do everything. They are all of our signalling. They tell us what to do all the time. They tell us if we're hungry, they tell us if we're full, they tell us if we're tired, whether we're energetic, whether we're happy, sad, sleepy. So without the right hormones, things get really out of whack. So our primary hormones do the majority of the work, and our secondary hormones just cause a little bit of excess agitation if things are out of whack. So our secondary hormones are our sex hormones, the things that give us our sexual characteristics. But they can also cause unwanted characteristics if we get them in the right levels. So if the stress hormones are out of whack, the secondary hormones are always out of whack. They're in the same pathway. So you can see to get low progesterone, you have to have this cortisol pathway not working, and to get low estrogens or testosterones or high estrogens or testosterones, it all has to go through the DHEA and DHEAS pathway. So we don't treat secondary hormones because we should never really need to. If the primary hormones are in their place, the secondary hormones will self-adjust. Okay, this is an example of an adrenal hormone test, which is our primary hormone, so cortisol. High cortisol gives us agitation, makes us feel wired but also tired. So even if you wake up in the morning and you bounce out of bed, doesn't mean you don't feel lousy for the whole day. These people will come in and just say, I'm just so stressed, I'm just really overwhelmed. That's the first stages of stress. When stress goes on for long periods of time, we get low cortisol. Our body cannot produce those levels of hormones for that long. We cannot pump it out like we're asking for it. So long-term stress ends with a low cortisol environment, and this is that really chronic fatigue picture. Usually with low cortisol and high stress, people are looking at quitting their job, selling their kids on the black market, whatever it takes to get their energy back up. You've really got to change your life at this point. Unfortunately, not everyone can change their life, so they're caring for a sick loved one, something like that. There are circumstances where we can't change. These people just need long-term stress hormone support. It's very simple and easy to do, doesn't cost a fortune, and it'll stop you having a nervous breakdown, so that's fairly important. Okay, these are our secondary hormones, our sex hormones, so you can see that they get, significantly out of whack. Low progesterone causes emotional instability, so these people are going to be feeling, this is like your PMS kind of woman. You don't want to be the couple of days before her period, you don't want to say anything. She looks great in everything, just give her the chocolate and leave her alone. Testosterone being high like that, so this is a female, so testosterone's pretty high. If you have high testosterone like that and low progesterone like that, you are one step away from being a raging bull that's also crying at the same time. So it's a mess. That is a mess. Lucky, I know who this is, and she was a bit of a mess at the time. So the estrogen here, so the estrogen's mid-range in your E2, but your E1 and 3 has actually gone right up there. Now E3 usually doesn't elevate unless there's a pregnancy environment or we're postmenopausal. It's our protective estrogen. You'll only get that if there's been a really long-term stress situation. So adjusting those primary hormones, we probably would give a bit of progesterone support in this case, but the rest you'd probably just do a bit of estrogen clearance, and the rest will sort itself out. Genetics. So genetics is what we're talking about when we talk about methylation. The thing that annoys me most about people talking about methylation and genetics is that we assume that if you have a gene issue, that means you have a gene issue that's visible or that is existent. So for example, you can have the breast cancer gene and not have breast cancer. You can have MTHFR disorders and not have issues with your methylation. And the reason why is because methylation is from nutrition. So I regularly get people into my clinic that are telling me they're an over-methylator or an under-methylator, and it's just not really reality. There's no such thing as over or under. It's a very complex environment. And one person can be an under-methylating today and over-methylating 3 weeks' time. So you can't say, oh, yep, when I did my genetic testing, it showed me this. It's just not correct. It's not how our body works. It's constantly changeable. This is what methylation is. They are all nutrients. So saying that one is permanent is not correct and also a little bit silly. They're dependent on bacteria and nutrition. So this is a person's methylation profile in 2020. So you can see that the copper is very low, the SAMe and SAH is very low, zinc's low, and the histamine's very high. So the same person 12 months later has very low histamine, high copper, high homocysteine. So all of these things are sort of flipped on their head. So this is the same person. If it was truly genetic, and it would be stuck there. But so just because you have the genetic potential doesn't mean you have the genetic expression. So don't just assume because you tested something, 10 years ago, that that's the same state you're in. It'll end very badly if you treat these pathways in the wrong direction. You will get considerably worse very, very quickly. So always test, never guess this stuff. Nutritional deficiencies, we've talked about exogenous and endogenous, so the stuff we put in versus the stuff that bacteria produce for us. So they're very important. We can do some useful, simple tests through your GP that'll give us an information of that. And environmental factors. So we cannot underestimate trauma. Trauma is our biggest cause of mental health issues. It's also the biggest cause of physical health issues. So here's an example. So an ACE score of 4 nearly doubles your risk of heart disease and lung cancer. Okay. Now that's the questions that are in an ACE score are things like, are your parents still together? Did you have a parent that uses drug or alcohols? Do you have an incarcerated parent? Did you have domestic violence in the home? Did you have drug or alcohol abuse in the home? Now, not very many people say no to all of those. Realistically, most families in Australia will have someone that drinks a fair bit on the weekends. And most families, realistically, most families break down now. We regularly have people that are on there, that have had marriage breakdowns. It's not unusual. So you know, a lot of people are answering yes to 4 or more of these questions, and it's causing these massive physical health issues. The likelihood of becoming an alcoholic increases by 700% with an ACE score of 4. 700% is a phenomenal statistic. So next time you pass somebody and you think, oh, you know, there's some lame drunk on the street in the middle of the day, just think, what happened to you? Something happened to them to get there. This is not about placing blame on shitty choices. It doesn't really work like that. Something's happened to that person to make them to get them into that position. They have all of these things plus more going on in their brain. So we should be looking at these people with compassion because it's an illness like any other. Stress is obviously a big one. Exposure to toxins, people that work in environments where they have a lot of glue exposure and things like that tend to have methylation issues that cause this. Sleep quality is a big one. So if you have 10 kids and every kid wakes up every hour, you're going to have a lot of problems here. So definitely our sleep quality and sleep quantity is a really big one. I get a lot of people that do shift work in the door, and shift work is a big risk factor. So next time you're hanging out with a nurse who does shift work, thank them immensely because they are doing a really crappy job that is having a really big impact on their body, and they're doing it so that people like us have healthcare when we need it. So. Employment, so obviously employment is a big factor, and our social interactions. So again, this is just another explanation of what's on the board over there. So our mental health problems are physical. To treat them, we have to treat those physical things. We have to treat gut bacteria. We have to treat neurochemistry, and we have to treat stress hormones. And you can't guess it, you have to test. So realistically, you want to be testing methylation pathways because you can't treat them without it. You want to be testing digestive bacteria, and you want to be testing stress hormones. We can adjust nutrition. Treating these will adjust nutrition, and the neurochemistry we can do through symptom profiles. But we can also test if you want to, but there's not a great deal of difference in the outcome between those who spend $400 on that test and those who don't. So, does anybody have any questions about any of that? Yes, shoot.
After spending some investment in my mouth last year with a biological dentist, and a lot of that is addressing bacteria in the mouth, how does that relate to this type of bacteria? Is that a separate issue?
No, it's not a separate issue. It is the same issue. So basically, bacteria in your mouth is obviously always swallowed. If you have good gastric acid levels, it shouldn't be a big deal. But not very many people have good gastric acid levels long term, especially between meals. It's literally designed to drop off. So if you do have poor oral hygiene, you are going to be more predisposed. But likewise, if you have bad gut bacteria, you will always have bad oral hygiene. So often what we see is people come in, they do have that as a symptom, and I automatically go, okay, that's a strep issue in the gut, or that's a staph issue in the gut. I never treat the oral hygiene. It takes care of itself as you treat the rest. Yeah. So does that answer the question? Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions? Yeah.
Whereabouts are you located?
Here at Maroochydore. Yeah, but I only work by Zoom, so you can see me from anywhere in the country. Don't have to be located here. Any others? Yeah.
So you're saying that you need to, if you've got any of these issues, you need to be tested to make sure you know what is going on in your gut before you can address.
Yeah. So if you guess this, you'll get it wrong. So even if I guess it, I get it wrong, and I've been doing it for a long time. You know, so sometimes I think, oh, this person's really not got the funds to do this, but you know, I'm trying to help because they obviously need the help. Those people I almost always get wrong, because low Bacteroides, for example, looks the same as high E. coli, and low lactobacillus or high bifidobacteria looks the same as low Bacteroides. So if I guess it and I get it wrong, I make that person worse. So I have a basic philosophy in my clinic, and I say it to everyone: I test, I don't guess. And even as a very educated person with a very good guess, I'm still getting that wrong if I try. And I often try and guess for myself because I'm cheap and don't want to spend money on testing. And I get that wrong regularly as well. So that's good to know, isn't it? Even when you know yourself very well, you can get it wrong. So yeah, definitely there's just no point in doing it if you're not going to do the testing. You're better off putting the funds into a different area. In my clinic, I offer a free 30-minute consultation. In that consultation, I determine whether I realistically can get 80% treatment outcome from that client. If I don't think I can get that, then I refer them to someone else. I'll send them in a different direction where their funds are better spent. So there's no point starting this process and spending a fortune on testing if I don't think I can get the outcome. So it's really important to make sure that it's the right clinic for you and that you're going to get the outcome that you need. So there's, so for me in my clinic, I always say, yep, a prerequisite is that we do have to do that testing to make sure that we get that treatment right.
And how much is the testing, and then what happens after the testing? Do you give supplements and things like that?
Yeah, so it depends on the client. So basically before that free 30-minute consultation, I get your full health history, I review it, and then I come to you and say, okay, this is realistically what I think we need. We might only need one of these tests because I can clearly see it's coming from one area, or we might need all three. So it just depends, and the testing varies on the level of requirement. So sometimes it'll just be one thing, and sometimes I need quite a complex lot of information. So that depends on your symptom picture. No two treatments are the same.
And so then once you've been tested, do you treat through supplements?
Yep, through supplementation and herbal medicines. Yep. And sometimes I send you to a GP for medications if it's something that I can't prescribe. Yep. Yep.
Sorry, what was long-term SNRI use?
Yep.
And then coming off long-term SNRI use.
Yep.
How much of that is going to be impacted?
Long-term SNRI use is going to kill off, well, SSRI use specifically kills E. coli, so it changes the way that your digestive bacteria works, and SNRI depends on the specific drug. And the dosage that you've been on, the length of time, but it's definitely treatable neurochemically.
And the withdrawals?
The withdrawal is a symptom of the medication, but yes, you can. It's definitely ways to do that supported that it doesn't have to struggle. You don't have to struggle through that. Yeah, it shouldn't feel lousy. If it feels lousy, then something needs to be addressed. Can I help?
So you said what testing was you recommended all the time?
It just depends on the client. Yeah, so different for each person.
No.
The stool test, you mean?
No, the testing you said you only went with this.
Bioscreen Medical. Yeah, that's for the stool test.
Oh, right.
Yeah, yeah. So if I'm going to do a stool test, I only use Bioscreen. Yeah. Sorry, you had a question before?
I know, it's kind of relating to the...
Okay, cool. All right. Yes?
Given how important you said gut health is, what's one thing that we could do from today that would just help have a healthy gut?
Reduce carbohydrate intake. Yeah, so there's a primary issue that we see over and over and over again, and that's overgrowth of D-lactate producing bacteria, and they're all carbohydrate dependent species. So a general reduction in sugars in the diet, including fruit sugars, so consider having berries and things like that over your big sweet fruits. Yeah, I mean mangoes are delicious, so I would never oppose mangoes. Maybe just avoid the bananas and apples and stick with the berries. Keep the mangoes in. Any other questions?
You were just saying avoid bananas?
Yeah, bananas actually have the same glycemic index as a Mars bar. So you may as well eat the Mars bar, I reckon. Not that that's great advice. Don't quote me on that. Did you just record that? Yeah, they're also, yeah, exactly. Dip it in chocolate, that's right. They also have a really high acid content. So they do, if you do have a reflux issue or an issue with that gut wall integrity, bananas aren't really a great food. Yeah.
That's so confusing.
You probably love bananas. I do love to torture people who love things.
Banana a day.
Oh, absolutely not. No. Yeah.
When they talk about benefits of potassium.
Yeah, there's potassium's in all your vegetables and things like that. That's marketing. I mean, it is marketing. The people are trying to sell bananas.
If you're missing a gallbladder or something like that,
Yep.
does that affect all of this as well?
It does to a certain extent, but you can always, so say for example, if you have no gallbladder, you could take something with each meal that does that role. So then you won't end up with long-term health consequences of that. So you can definitely take something longer term that reduces the risk of this type of condition occurring. Yeah. All right, guys, we've got to get out of this room. The next person's knocking at the door.